Imagine for a moment the paralyzing physical sensation of living in a place where the most dangerous sound in the world is not the war cry of an enemy army, but the muffled cry of a newborn inside your own home. A sound that should bring joy, but now carries the weight of an immediate death sentence, decreed by the cruelest law the Empire has ever produced. The air inside that hidden room is thick, heavy with the strong smell of bitumen and melted pitch, an olfactory mixture that would forever be etched in that mother's memory as the aroma of farewell, while her fingers, calloused by slave labor but guided by a fierce love, hastily weave a small arc of reeds that will serve, paradoxically, as the only possible shield between her child's fragile life and the deep waters of the great river that flows outside. There is a silent, unbearable tension in her every movement, the kind of fear that makes your heart pound in your throat with every sound of sandals marching on the dirt road, because she knows she is not just building a basket, but preparing a floating coffin in the desperate hope that it will become a cradle of salvation. She looks at the child's face, sleeping oblivious to the political terror that desires its end, and feels that visceral, almost surgical pain of someone who needs to amputate a part of their own body so that that part can survive far from her. The decision to let go is not an act of abandonment, but the most violent and painful form of protection that maternal love has ever been forced to invent, defying the logic of holding on to save and embracing the madness of surrendering to the uncertain current in the hope that fate will be kinder than the gold-crowned men who rule the earth with hearts of stone. When the basket touches the cold surface of the water and her hands finally withdraw, empty and trembling, there is a moment of absolute silence in the universe, where human control ends and an invisible, sovereign force must begin to operate, or all will be lost forever in the jaws of crocodiles or the indifference of the current. That small object adrift carries much more than a condemned Hebrew child. It carries the oldest and most agonizing question of the human soul. What happens when we are cast adrift without visible protection in a world that seems designed to destroy us before we even have a chance to say our name? The current carries it slowly, swaying between life and death, a perfect image of our own fragility in the face of gigantic circumstances we cannot control, navigating hostile territory where death lurks both on the surface and in the depths. But as that basket drifts away from the safe shore, entering the forbidden territory of palaces and royal gardens, something begins to stir behind the scenes of the story, an invisible plot suggesting that abandonment may not be the end, but the strange and painful beginning of an elevation that no one could have foreseen. The river that should be the tomb becomes the road, and the current that should drown becomes the transport, proving that sometimes it is precisely at the moment when we lose all our sense of security that we are unknowingly being guided to the exact center of a purpose that will make empires tremble and seas part. The child cries inside, a lonely sound on the waters, unaware that his cry is about to awaken compassion in the most unlikely place on earth, initiating a chain reaction that will transform a condemned castaway into the prince of two worlds. The miracle of that rescue in the waters of the Nile resulted not only in the physical survival of a child, but in the inauguration of one of the most sublime and mysterious ironies of divine providence, where the very palace that decreed the death of the Hebrews became the safe incubator for their future liberator. Imagine the psychological complexity of growing up in the cold marble corridors of the most powerful court on earth, being called son of Pharaoh's daughter, wearing the fine linen of royalty and learning the geometry of the pyramids, while the milk that nourished his first years came secretly from the breast of his own biological mother, paid by the empire to raise the son she should have delivered to death. Moses grows up, therefore, as a man divided between two irreconcilable worlds. Outwardly, he carries the haughty posture, the polished accent, and the military wisdom of Egypt, trained to command armies and design cities. But inwardly, in the quietest layers of his conscience, runs the blood of an enslaved people whom he sees every day, building the glory of his adoptive parents with the sweat of their agony. This inner dissonance is the kind of silent storm that corrodes a man's soul as he walks through royal banquets, knowing that every piece of bread he eats has the bitter taste of his blood brother's tears, creating an identity crisis that not all the gold in Egypt can silence. He is a prince, yes, but he is a prince haunted by the truth of who he really is, living with the constant feeling of being an imposter in his own life, a foreigner in the palace and a stranger among his people, awaiting the inevitable moment when the dam of this inner tension will break with devastating consequences. And the rupture happens not in a moment of strategic planning or divine revelation, but in an instant of raw, human fury, when the mask of royalty falls and the instinct for justice explodes uncontrollably in the face of the brutality of oppression. He goes out to see the burdens of his brothers, a dangerous move for someone who descends from the pedestal to touch the open wound of reality, and his eyes, trained for the beauty of the court, collide with the ugliness of slavery when he sees an Egyptian overseer beating a defenseless Hebrew. In that second, the veneer of Egyptian education dissolves, and Moses does not react like a diplomatic prince, but like a man desperate to fix the world with his own hands, dominated by a righteous yet uncontrolled rage that leads him to look around, make sure there are no witnesses, and deliver the fatal blow that takes the oppressor's life. The silence that follows the thud of the body falling to the sand is deafening, for in that act of impulsive violence, he attempted to anticipate liberation through the force of human arms, believing he could be the judge and executor of God's justice through the sword of the flesh. He hides the body in the sand, a futile and symbolic gesture that we all repeat when we try to cover up our mistakes, thinking that the earth can swallow our transgressions and that secrecy will protect us from the consequences, without realizing that the sand is a fickle witness and that nothing done in the strength of the flesh remains buried forever. He returns to the palace with clean hands, but with a stained soul, now carrying not only the secret of his origin, but the weight of a capital crime, naively believing that his act of force would give him authority over the people he tried to defend. But the reality of the following day brings a bitter and humiliating lesson about the nature of leadership and human rejection. For when he returns, perhaps expecting to be hailed as a secret hero or an avenger of the oppressed, he finds only distrust and fear in the eyes of those he tried to save. Attempting to break up a fight between two Hebrews, now intervening as a moral peacemaker, he is confronted with the question that dismantles his entire constructed self-image. Who appointed you prince and judge over us? Do you intend to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? The revelation that his secret is known runs down his spine like deadly ice. But the greatest pain is not the fear of Pharaoh, it is the rejection of his own people. They did not see in him a liberator. They saw only another murderer, another dangerous man from the palace. Rejection hurts most when it comes from those for whom you bled or for whom you risked everything. And Moses discovers in the hardest way that spiritual authority is not won through violence, and that the title of prince is worthless in the mire of slavery if there is no divine calling validated by time. He realizes with terror that he does not belong to Egypt because he killed an Egyptian, and he does not belong to the Hebrews because they reject him as a judge. He has become a man without a homeland, without protection, and without purpose, isolated in a dangerous vacuum where the only remaining option is not to fight, but a desperate escape to save the only thing he has left, his miserable life. The flight to the land of Midian is not merely a geographical journey through a scorching desert. It is a dizzying descent from glory to anonymity, a painful stripping away of all the layers of identity he used to cover his existential nakedness for 40 years. Imagine the prince who commanded chariots now walking alone, thirsty and dusty, exchanging royal banquets for sand in his teeth, fleeing the death sentence decreed by the pharaoh who once called him grandson. Each step toward the desert is a step away from everything he knew as self, and there is a symbolic death happening there, far deeper than the death of the Egyptian he buried. God is allowing Moses to lose everything: status, power, family, comfort, and even the pretense of being the liberator, so that he may, finally, be emptied of himself. Midian is the place of oblivion, the land where failed heroes go to disappear, and as he sits by a well in a foreign land, defending Jethro's daughters from rude shepherds, he no longer does so as a prince demanding respect, but as a fugitive seeking only a sip of water and a place to rest his head. He agrees to live with that priest, agrees to marry Zipporah, and most shocking of all, agrees to become a shepherd, an abomination to the Egyptian culture in which he was raised. The man who was educated in all the science of Egypt now spends his days tending to animals that cannot speak, learning patience in silence, humility in routine, and dependence in solitude. He names his son Gershon, a pilgrim in a strange land, a name that is a cry from his displaced soul, marking the beginning of a 40-year winter where the great Moses seems to have been archived by history, buried alive in the dust of a nameless desert, while the people in Egypt continue to groan under the whip, seemingly forgotten by God and the man who tried to save them. 40 years is far too long to live in anonymity, especially when your mind still holds the memories of a palace where you were treated like a god in the making. But now the only royalty left is the dust covering your face and the ingrained smell of sheep that has replaced the expensive perfumes of Egypt. The desert of Midian is not just a geographical exile, it's a brutal decompression chamber where Moses' identity is systematically ground down by silence, day after day, under a relentless sun that doesn't care who he was or what he could have been. Imagine the psychological torture of walking through those arid mountains, holding a wooden staff instead of a golden scepter, guiding stubborn animals instead of disciplined armies, feeling your youth slip away as your skin tans and your hair turns grey, convinced that your life is over and that you are just a forgotten footnote in the history of a people who continue to suffer. The silence of God during those 4 decades is deafening, a void that screams that the liberator failed, that the assassination was in vain, and that the impetuous zeal of youth was nothing more than foolish arrogance that cost him everything. Moses learns to be nobody with the same intensity that he learned to be somebody, and this lesson in insignificance is the painful but necessary prerequisite for what is to come, for God cannot fill a man who is already full of himself. He needs to be emptied to the last drop of his Egyptian self-confidence until nothing remains of the powerful prince, leaving only a stammering and insecure shepherd, because it is only upon the scorched earth of our ego that the sacred fire can descend without destroying us. And then, on a day that dawned as ordinary and monotonous as the previous 14,000 days, the sacred routine of boredom is interrupted by a visual anomaly that defies the laws of nature and captures the attention of a man who thought he had seen everything. Leading the flock to the western side of the desert, arriving at Mount Horeb, Moses sees a bush, a dry, worthless shrub common in that arid region, engulfed in violent flames. But against all logic of physics and human experience, the wood does not burn, the leaves do not turn to ashes, and the fire needs no fuel to continue burning. That vision is a shock to Moses' rational mind, educated in the sciences of Egypt, for he knows that fire is, by nature, a hungry devourer that destroys everything it touches. but there is a flame that is self-sufficient, that exists by itself, without depending on the structure of the plant to survive. It is the perfect visual metaphor for God's own nature, a being who does not need us to exist, who does not consume our humanity to manifest his glory, but who chooses to dwell in the midst of our dry fragility without destroying us in the process. Moses' curiosity, that instinct of, "I'll turn around and see," is the first step of faith, the movement of one who decides to stop looking at the sheep and the dusty ground of his own failure to face the mystery that shines on the periphery of his vision. He does not know, as he adjusts his sandals to approach, that fire is not just a strange natural phenomenon, but the end of his 40 years of silence and the beginning of a conversation that will change the political and spiritual geography of the world forever. When the voice emerges from the midst of the fire, it doesn't call by title, military rank, or royal lineage. It calls by name, repeating it twice with an intimacy that pierces the soul. "Moses, Moses." That sound reverberates in the rocks of Horeb and in the empty chambers of the shepherd's heart, proving that even in the deepest exile, he was never off the divine radar, never forgotten in the vastness of the sand. But the intimacy of the call comes accompanied by a demand for radical holiness. Do not come any closer. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Taking off one's sandals is an act of extreme vulnerability and cultural surrender. It is removing the artificial protection that separates us from the filth of the world. It is relinquishing the right of ownership over the ground we tread, and acknowledging that we are invading territory that does not belong to us. There, barefoot, feeling the heat of the earth and the trembling of his own legs, Moses discovers that God's holiness is not safe, not tameable, and not something one can casually negotiate with. He hides his face, terrified, because he instinctively understands that a man guilty of murder and full of doubt cannot look upon the face of the eternal and survive. The revelation that fire is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob connects the lonely shepherd to a stream of ancient promises he thought had been broken, showing that the God of history does not suffer from amnesia and that human waiting time does not negate divine faithfulness. But the real shock doesn't come from the fire or the voice, but from the impossible mission placed on the shoulders of a man who feels like the most inadequate creature on earth to accomplish it. God declares, "I have seen the affliction of my people, and I have come down to deliver them. Come now, and I will send you to Pharaoh." The irony is overwhelming. 40 years ago, Moses felt ready, strong, and capable of liberating Israel by the strength of his arm, and God said no. Now, feeling old, defeated, stammering, and without any influence, God says go. Moses' response is not one of gratitude or enthusiasm, but of panic and total resistance. Who am I to go to Pharaoh? This question reveals the depth of the identity crisis that the desert has wrought in him. He no longer sees the prince, only the imposter. He lists his excuses like a defense attorney trying to prove his own incompetence. He lacks eloquence, he lacks authority, he doesn't even know God's name. But to every "I can't" from Moses, God responds with the only truth that matters: I am. The revelation of the divine name, YHWH, I am who I am, is not merely a theological label. It is the guarantee of an active, unchanging, and self-sufficient presence that will be the true engine of liberation. God is not hiring Moses' skills, he is renting Moses' availability. The old shepherd's staff he holds in his hand, that piece of dead wood that served to guide dumb sheep for decades, is transformed right there into the rod of God, the tool that will part seas and bring plagues, proving that God loves to use what is common and despicable to humble what is powerful. Moses descends from that mountain not as a confident hero puffing out his chest, but as a man overcome by God's insistence, carrying a mission too great for him, yet supported by a promise greater than any empire. He returns to Egypt, to the scene of his crime and shame, not riding in a war chariot but on a donkey with his wife and children, appearing ridiculous in the eyes of the world, but armed with the authority of heaven. That 80-year-old man, with sunburnt skin and calloused hands, is now God's ticking time bomb, planted in the heart of the world's superpower. The silence of the desert is over, and the time for confrontation has begun. He still feels fear. His legs still tremble, and his tongue still stumbles, but he has learned the most important lesson of all in the school of Midian. It's not about who Moses is. It's about who is with him. And with that certainty burning in his chest stronger than the burning bush, he walks towards the palace where he grew up, ready to look into the eyes of the most powerful man on earth and say the phrase that will echo for all eternity: "Let my people go." Moses' return to Egypt is not the triumphal march of a hero returning home, but the beginning of a spiritual and psychological confrontation that would shake the foundations of the ancient world. For he carries no armies, swords, or military strategies, but only the invisible authority of a word given to him in the burning bush. Entering the courtyards of the palace that was once his home, walking alongside his brother Aaron, he feels the crushing weight of challenging the greatest superpower on earth, armed only with a wooden staff and a divine promise. The first audience with Pharaoh is a brutal clash of reality, where obedience to God collides head-on with human arrogance. The monarch's response, "Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice?" is not merely a political refusal, but a declaration of spiritual war. Pharaoh, who considers himself a living god, cannot conceive of the existence of an authority superior to his own, and his immediate reaction is to punish the people's hope, taking away the straw needed to make bricks, but demanding the same quota of production. It is the devastating moment when things drastically worsen before they improve, and Moses finds himself caught in the crossfire between the tyrant's cruelty and the desperate hatred of his own people, who now curse him for making slavery even more unbearable. The pain of obeying God and seeing suffering increase is one of the most difficult tests of faith, and Moses returns to the Lord's presence not with a report of victory, but with a cry of anguish. "Why did you send me?" questioning whether liberation was merely a cruel illusion born in the heat of the desert. But God's silence in the face of Moses' complaint is broken not by an excuse, but by a revelation of sovereignty that redefines the battlefield. "Now you will see what I will do to Pharaoh." What follows is not a diplomatic negotiation, but a systematic and violent deconstruction of the entire theology and worldview of Egypt, where each plague sent is not merely a natural disaster, but a surgical strike against the false gods that kept that empire standing. When the sacred waters of the Nile turn to blood, exhaling a stench of death that covers the land, it is not merely a sanitation problem. It is the public murder of Hapi, the river god, proving that the source of Egypt's life was now under the judgment of the god of slaves. The escalation of terror is relentless. Frogs invade the innermost chambers of the palace, mocking the goddess Heket. The dust of the earth transforms into lice, humiliating the priests who prized ritual purity, and swarms of flies cover the land, except for the region of Goshen, drawing a visible line between those who belong to Pharaoh and those who belong to Yahweh. With each blow, Pharaoh's pride hardens, transforming his heart into an insensitive stone that prefers to see his kingdom destroyed rather than bend the knee. A terrifying image of human resistance, fighting against truth to the point of utter self-destruction. Moses, the man who fled in fear of a single assassination, now stands firm at the center of a national apocalypse, growing in spiritual stature as he watches the empire that created him crumble under the weight of God's hand. The battle reaches an unbearable level of psychological terror when darkness descends upon Egypt, not the ordinary darkness of night, but a touchable darkness, a supernatural gloom that extinguishes the sun for 3 whole days. For a nation that worshipped Ra, the sun god, as the supreme deity, seeing the sky completely close was the definitive sign that their gods were dead and that chaos had won. Imagine the oppressive silence in Egyptian homes, where no one dared to move, paralyzed by the fear of a god who could extinguish the light of the world, while a few kilometers away, in the homes of the Hebrews, there was light. This clear distinction was not human merit, but sovereign grace, setting the stage for the final blow that would break the backbone of Pharaoh's resistance. God announces the 10th plague with a blood-curdling solemnity, the death of the firstborn. There would be no more warnings, no negotiations, no chances for repentance. The sentence had been decreed, and the only way to escape was not to be Egyptian or Hebrew, rich or poor, but to be covered in the blood of an innocent lamb. The institution of Passover on that fateful night is the beating heart of redemption. Each family was to sacrifice a lamb without blemish and paint the doorposts with its blood, a visual sign of faith that would cry out to the angel of death, "Death has already been here, pass over." The night of the 10th plague is charged with an electric tension that no film has ever managed to fully capture. For while Hebrew families hastily eat the roasted lamb, loins girded and sandals on their feet, ready to depart, the sound of death begins to sweep across Egypt at midnight. The cry that rises is not of battle, but of a simultaneous and deafening mourning that echoes from every house where there was no blood on the door, from Pharaoh's throne to the prisoner's dungeon. The death of the heir to the throne is the final blow to Pharaoh's divine pride, irrefutable proof that he has no power even over the life of his own son. The empire built on the blood of innocence now drowns in its own tears, and the order of expulsion is given not with authority, but with despair. "Get out from among my people." Nay, the liberation happens not as a furtive escape, but as an urgent expulsion, where the Egyptians, terrified by the possibility of all being killed, give gold, silver, and clothing to their slaves, fulfilling the ancient promise that they would not leave empty-handed. That mass of people, about 600,000 men, besides women and children, begins to move like a human river, leaving behind 400 years of whips and chains, walking towards the unknown guided not by maps, but by a pillar of fire that tears through the night sky. The exodus from Egypt is the birth of a nation, a painful and miraculous delivery where a people without identity is forged in the fire of divine liberation. Moses walks ahead, no longer the insecure shepherd of Midian, but the leader of a mixed multitude, carrying on their shoulders the bones of Joseph, and in their hearts the hope of a promised land. The sound of chains falling to the ground is the music of that night, but freedom brings with it new dangers and responsibilities they do not yet understand. As they march away from the pyramids that consume their lives, they do not know that the shortest path to Canaan has been blocked by God, and that they are being intentionally led into a geographical trap before the Red Sea. The liberation of the body was instantaneous, but the liberation of the enslaved mind would be a long and painful process, and Moses, looking at that euphoric crowd, knows that the real challenge was not to take Israel out of Egypt, but to take Egypt out of Israel. The euphoria of victory mixes with the fear of the unknown, and the journey that begins with the sound of tambourines will soon be tested by thirst, hunger, and longing for the pots of meat from slavery, proving that faith is not a one-time event, but a daily walk of trust in the one who opened the prison door. The euphoria of the departure, with its tambourines and chants of freedom, has a frighteningly short shelf life when geographical reality begins to close in on a crowd that still thinks like slaves. The triumphal march soon turns into a tactical nightmare, for God, in his strategic and disconcerting sovereignty, does not lead them by the easy and direct trade route, but guides them into a deadly dead end between insurmountable mountains and the impassable vastness of the Red Sea. It is there, trapped on the beach of Pi Haroth, that the sound of freedom is suddenly muffled by the dull, rhythmic noise that makes the blood of any Hebrew freeze, the thunder of 600 war chariots tearing through the desert in a vengeful pursuit. The cloud of dust on the horizon announces not only an army, but the return of the ghosts of the past, who refuse to let go of their possessions. Pharaoh changed his mind, and the fury of a master who has lost his slaves is a demonic force seeking not only to recapture but to annihilate. The panic that sweeps through the Hebrew camp is instantaneous and visceral, a collective hysteria that reveals how superficial their faith in liberation was. They look at the sea ahead, at the swords behind, and the logical conclusion of the traumatized mind is immediate. Moses brought us here to die. The cry they hurl at their leader, "Were there no graves in Egypt?" is one of the most painful and revealing phrases in the Bible, showing that for those who have lived their entire lives in chains, the safety of a known grave in Egypt seems more attractive than the mortal risk of freedom in the desert. They prefer predictable slavery to uncertain death, proving that it is possible to remove the chains from a man's wrists in one night, but removing the fear from his heart requires a far greater miracle. Moses finds himself alone in the midst of this whirlwind of terror, a man squeezed between the hysterical disbelief of his own people and the apparent silence of God in the face of impending catastrophe. He feels the weight of 2 million accusing gazes that minutes before venerated him as a hero and now condemn him as a lunatic deceiver who led them into a trap. But it is in this moment of maximum pressure, when human logic screams, "Surrender," that the leader's faith becomes the only anchor preventing the entire nation from sinking into despair. He does not call a war council, does not distribute improvised weapons, nor suggest a surrender negotiation. He stands on a rock, raises his voice above the cries of children and the shouts of men, and utters the most absurd and powerful command a general could give in the face of an imminent massacre. "Do not be afraid. Stand still and see the deliverance the Lord will give you." The command to be still when death approaches at a gallop is an act of spiritual rebellion against chaos, a declaration that the battle does not belong to those with the most iron chariots, but to him who controls the elements. And then the pillar of cloud that guided them, in a spectacular act of divine protection, shifts from the vanguard to the rear guard, interposing itself as a wall of impenetrable darkness for the Egyptians and a source of supernatural light for Israel, creating a physical separation between God's people and their pursuers, ensuring that on that night the enemy could not touch even the hem of the garments of his chosen ones. What happens next defies imagination and rewrites the laws of physics. Moses stretches out that same old staff over the dark waters, and a strong east wind, blown by the very breath of God, begins to cut the sea in two with the precision of a surgical scalpel. The waters, which by nature are fluid and untamable, obey their creator and freeze into liquid walls to the right and left, opening a road of dry land at the bottom of the abyss, a path where before there was only death and darkness. The crossing of the Red Sea is not merely a displacement from point A to point B. It is a rite of passage, a national baptism where Israel descends into the womb of symbolic death to emerge on the other side as a new creation. Imagine the sensory sensation of walking along the seabed, smelling the salt and seaweed, hearing the roar of the wind, holding tons of water suspended above your head, walking in the light of the pillar of fire while the most powerful army in the world is paralyzed in the darkness behind you. It is a journey of absolute faith, where each step is a test of confidence that the waters will not collapse, and where the people learn, in the midst of the corridor of fear, that God does not deliver us from problems by circumventing them, but makes us pass through the midst of them, transforming the obstacle itself into a path of escape. As dawn breaks and the last Hebrew sets foot on the opposite shore, the divine trap closes with just violence upon the pursuers who, in their blind arrogance, dared to enter the sacred path opened for the children of God. The wheels of the heavy chariots begin to jam in the mud, panic shifts, and the Egyptian soldiers, realizing too late that they were fighting against the divine, cry out to flee, but Moses' command, extending his hand, causes the sea to return to its place with the force of a tsunami. The roar of the waters colliding and swallowing the pride of Egypt is the final sound of liberation. Not a single soldier remains to tell the tale, and the bodies that appear on the beach are tangible proof that the threat that terrorized generations has been swept away forever. Israel sees in that glorious dawn their masters dead on the sand, and the fear of the Lord falls upon them not as a slave's fear, but as a profound reverence before a warrior savior. Miriam picks up the tambourine, and the victory song explodes. Not like a rehearsed piece of music, but like a primal relief from someone who realizes that the chains have been broken not only in their hands, but in history. They are free, and the sea that barred their path has become the tomb of their enemies. But human nature is volatile, and the memory of gratitude is tragically short when bodily comfort is threatened. Just 3 days after seeing the sea part, the same crowd that sang praises now murmurs with dry, cracked lips before the waters of Mara. Thirst in the desert is a cruel test that exposes what is truly within the heart. And upon finding water that is bitter and undrinkable, disillusionment is immediate. What shall we drink? The transition from worship to complaint is instantaneous, revealing that faith based solely on visible miracles does not sustain the soul in days of ordinary trial. They forget the power that destroyed Egypt because of a bitter taste in their mouths, showing that inner bondage still dictates their reactions. Moses, once again the lightning rod for popular frustration, cries out to the Lord, and God shows him not a new spring, but a piece of wood, a tree which, when thrown into the bitter waters, makes them sweet. It is a profound lesson in divine healing. God does not remove the problem, he transforms the nature of the problem by introducing a redeeming element. The wood that heals the waters is a harbinger that grace can sweeten even the bitterest circumstances of life, but the people are still learning to trust in the provider and not just in the provision. They drink, quench their thirst, and journey to Elim, where there are 12 springs and 70 palm trees, without realizing that the true desert, the desert of character transformation, is only beginning, and that the journey to the promised land will require much more than crossing a sea. It will require the death of the old man who still lives within each of them. Survival in the desert is not a matter of military strategy or hunting skill, but a daily and humbling lesson in absolute dependence, where God purposefully removes all human safety nets to teach his people that man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from his mouth. Famine arrives at the Israelite camp not as a logistical accident, but as a pedagogical test, and the immediate reaction of the multitude is, once again, the pathological nostalgia for Egypt, where pots of meat and abundant bread were the payment for their stolen freedom. It is fascinating and tragic to see how an empty stomach has the power to rewrite history, transforming years of whipping and torture into a golden memory of plenty, proving that slavery with a full belly is often more attractive to fallen human nature than freedom with risk. But God's response to ungrateful murmuring is not a lightning bolt of judgment, but a shower of white and mysterious grace that covers the desert floor at each dawn. Manna, that substance as fine as frost and as sweet as honey, is the materialization of daily providence. It cannot be stored, it cannot be hoarded, and it cannot be sold, rotting in the hands of those who try to secure tomorrow by the strength of their own arm. For 40 years, Israel has been forced to wake up every morning with an empty pantry and full confidence, learning the theology of our daily bread in practice, discovering that God's grace is fresh and sufficient for today, but requires that we return to Him tomorrow to seek more, healing the anxiety of scarcity with the certainty of His presence. But if hunger tests patience, thirst tests sanity, and when the people arrive at Rephidim and find no water, the veneer of civility completely breaks down, transforming pilgrims into a lynch mob ready to stone Moses. Dehydration in the desert is a slow and terrifying death, and collective panic makes them question God's very presence among them. Is the Lord among us or not? Moses, surrounded by the hatred of millions and the aridity of a place that offers only stones and scorpions, is instructed to do something that defies all geological and rational logic, to strike the hard rock with his staff. The rock, a symbol of sterility and isolation, becomes, under the blow of obedience, a source of abundant life, gushing rivers in the midst of the dryness to quench the thirst of an unworthy people. This image of the wounded rock that gives drink is one of the deepest shadows of the gospel in the Old Testament, suggesting that true life only springs forth when the eternal rock is wounded by divine justice, proving that God can draw refreshment from the harshest and most impossible circumstances of our lives, provided we have the courage to bring our thirst and our rod of judgment to Him. The water that flows through the sands of Rephidim not only quenches physical thirst, but also temporarily silences the accusation of abandonment, reminding Israel that God's provision is often hidden precisely where our eyes only see impossibility and hardship. However, the desert is not only a place of hunger and thirst, it is also a battlefield where Israel's existence is contested by enemies who desire its extinction before it even becomes an established nation. The Amalekites, predators of the desert, attack the weary rearguard, forcing former slaves who never held swords to fight for their very survival under the military leadership of young Joshua. But the real battle is not decided in the valley, where iron clashes with iron, but on the mountaintop, where Moses wages a spiritual war through visible intercession. The dynamic is clear and terrifying. When Moses' hands are raised in surrender and dependence on God, Israel prevails. When his arms grow weary and lower, the enemy advances. It is a brutal visual lesson on the unbreakable connection between the spiritual world and physical reality, showing that human effort, however valiant, is useless without the covering of continuous prayer. But Moses, the great leader, discovers his own physical limitation. He cannot keep his arms raised on his own. The image of Aaron and Hur supporting Moses' hands, one on each side, as he sits on a stone, is the definitive portrait of the community of faith. No one, not even the greatest prophet, wins alone. The victory against Amalek is collective, depending as much on Joshua's sword as on Moses' supporting arms, teaching Israel that interdependence is not weakness, but the only possible survival strategy in the hostile desert. The journey finally culminates at the base of Mount Sinai, the original destination of the Exodus, where the scene dramatically shifts from physical ordeal to sacred terror. Israel was not merely freed to roam freely, but to serve a king, and Sinai is the throne room where the marriage contract between God and His people will be sealed with fire and thunder. The mountain is not a place for a spiritual picnic, but a volcano of untouchable holiness, surrounded by boundaries that, if crossed, mean instant death. When God descends upon the summit, smoke rises like that of a furnace, the earth trembles violently, and the sound of a celestial trumpet increases in intensity until it becomes unbearable, causing the people to recoil and tremble in terror. There, God utters the 10 Commandments not as ethical suggestions, but as the absolute constitution of moral reality, revealing that freedom without law is merely a new form of enslavement to one's own instincts. The holiness of God is so weighty and dangerous that the people beg Moses to be the intermediary, preferring to hear the voice of a man rather than the direct voice of the Creator for fear of death. Sinai establishes the necessary distance between the sacred and the profane, healing Israel from the Egyptian idea that gods are manipulable toys or forces of nature that can be controlled by magic. Yahweh is the other, totally transcendent, dangerously pure, who demands not only rituals but a circumcised heart and an ethic of justice that reflects his own character. But the glory atop the mountain contrasts tragically with the corruption in the valley, creating one of the most painful episodes of spiritual betrayal in history. While Moses remains 40 days within the cloud, absorbing the details of the tabernacle, the blueprint for God's house, the people below cannot bear the silence and the absence of their visible leader. Faith based on vision crumbles when the vision is withdrawn, and in an act of religious panic, they pressure Aaron to fabricate a god they can see, touch, and control. The golden calf is not merely an idol, it is a desperate attempt to reduce the ineffable God of Sinai to a familiar Egyptian statue, a mute deity that demands no morality, only feasts and sacrifices. When Moses descends, carrying the stone tablets inscribed by the finger of God, the sound he hears is not of worship, but of rampant orgy and idolatry. The mediator's holy fury in breaking the tablets at the foot of the mountain is the physical representation of the breaking of the covenant the people had just made. They traded glory for an ox that eats grass. That day ends in judgment and death, a deep scar on the national memory that teaches that God's grace is immense, but his zeal is a consuming fire that does not share the throne with human inventions. Moses climbs the mountain again, not to receive laws, but to intercede for the life of a stiff-necked people, offering himself to be erased from God's book if that guaranteed the forgiveness of Israel, demonstrating the heart of a true shepherd who loves his sheep more than his own life, prefiguring the one who, centuries later, would climb another mountain to intercede definitively for us all. The construction of the tabernacle in the midst of a scorching desert is not merely an improbable architectural project, but the supreme therapeutic act of a nation desperately seeking moral rehabilitation after the shameful disaster of the golden calf. Imagine the surreal scene of artisans who until yesterday were slaves kneading clay under the whip, now manipulating pure gold, fine linen fabrics dyed blue, purple, and crimson, and precious stones that gleam under the merciless Sinai sun. There is a silent redemption happening in every hammer blow of Bezalel and Oholiab, for the same gold that was torn from ears to create a mute idol is now voluntarily offered to build the house of the living God, proving that our idolatrous past does not disqualify our future worship, provided that the raw material of our hearts is melted and reshaped by the fire of repentance. The tent that rises in the sand is not a monument to human greatness, but a sanctuary of embraced fragility, a sacred space where the God who fills the universe accepts, with incomprehensible humility, to compress his glory between curtains of goatskin, to dwell amidst the dirt, noise, and imperfections of his people. Each acacia plank covered in gold is a physical reminder that corruptible humanity can be clothed by divinity, and that God does not wait for us to become pure to come to us, but comes to us to make us pure through his dangerous and holy proximity. When the work is finally finished and the last piece of furniture is placed in the Holy of Holies, the phenomenon that defines Israel's identity forever occurs. The cloud of glory descends, heavy and tangible, filling the tabernacle with such density that not even Moses, the friend of God, can enter. The Shekinah is not a poetic metaphor, it is an atmospheric invasion of eternal reality in the present time, a luminous smoke signaling that the Creator has changed address and now camps next door. The vision of that cloud resting on the tent of meeting during the day and transforming into a pillar of fire during the night is the visual antidepressant of a nation traumatized by abandonment. They can sleep peacefully in their dark tents, knowing that the light that guides the universe is standing guard over their camp. The visible presence of God heals the spiritual orphanhood inherited from Egypt, teaching them that they are no longer disposable slaves of a distant pharaoh, but protected children of a father who is so near that it is possible to see the brilliance of his glory reflected in the surrounding dunes. Life in the desert ceases to be a random survival and becomes a liturgy of dependence, where everyone's eyes are not on the horizon searching for water, but on the cloud, seeking direction, learning the difficult art of standing still when God stands still, and moving immediately when God moves, without questions and without delays. The departure from Sinai marks the end of the spiritual honeymoon and the beginning of the practical march toward the promise, a transition that demands the theology learned on the mountain be translated into the dust of the road. When the cloud finally lifts, signaling that it is time to break camp, there is a mixture of excitement and dread. For leaving God's mountain means facing once again the vast and hostile unknown of the Paran Desert. The marching order is not chaotic, but military and liturgical. The tribes move with the precision of a celestial army, carrying the Ark of the Covenant on their shoulders, the mobile throne of Yahweh that goes before them to find a resting place. But the beauty of the order soon clashes with the ugliness of human nature. The road is hard, the sun is relentless, and the memory of the glory seen in the tabernacle begins to evaporate before the physical discomfort of the journey. The mixed people who left Egypt begin to crave meat, cucumbers, melons, and garlic, romanticizing past slavery in the face of present trials, a disease of the soul that makes us prefer the variety of hell's menu to the monotony of heavenly manna. Ingratitude is a cancer that spreads rapidly, transforming the march of conquest into a funeral of lamentations, where the cry for food becomes louder than the praise for freedom, provoking a fire of judgment at the edges of the camp that serves as a stern warning. God is patient with our weakness, but has zero tolerance for contempt for his miraculous provision. Moses' leadership is stretched to the breaking point under the weight of this dissatisfied crowd, leading him to a depressive crisis where he asks for his own death, confessing to God that the burden of carrying those people like a nurse carries a baby is too heavy for one man alone. It is a moment of brutal honesty that every spiritual leader faces, when the glorious vision is crushed by the mediocre reality of the people he leads. God does not respond with rebuke, but with the sharing of the Spirit. He instructs Moses to gather 70 elders, upon whom he places the same Spirit that was in Moses, democratizing the burden of leadership and proving that God's work should not be the show of one man alone, but the effort of an empowered community. The wind of God brings quail from the sea to satisfy the people's gluttony, but the meat comes accompanied by a plague, teaching the terrifying lesson that sometimes God gives us what we insistently ask for, only to show us that our disordered desire is, in fact, a disguised poison. They eat until the meat comes out of their nostrils, turning the feast into nausea, burying those who coveted in desert graves, funerary markers of those who traded satisfaction in God for the momentary pleasure of the palate. The arrival at Kadesh Barnea, on the border of the Promised Land, should have been the climax of the journey, the moment when faith would become possession, but it transforms into the stage for Israel's greatest national tragedy. 12 spies are sent to reconnoiter the land, men of status and leadership who were supposed to bring back a strategic report for the conquest. They return after 40 days carrying gigantic fruits that prove God's faithfulness. The land truly flows with milk and honey. It is fertile and lush, exactly as promised. But 10 of these men also carry a deadly virus called fear, disguised as realistic prudence. They report on the fortified walls, the giant sons of Anak, and most devastating of all, their own distorted self-image. We were in our own sight as grasshoppers, and so we were in their sight. This phrase is the terminal diagnosis of a generation that left Egypt but never let Egypt leave them. They look at the giants through the lens of their trauma of slavery, seeing themselves as insignificant insects about to be crushed, instead of seeing themselves as the army of the God who parted the Red Sea. Fear is contagious and paralyzes faster than any poison. That night, the entire camp cries in despair, refusing to step into the promise that was a step away, choosing the safety of the desert and slow death instead of the risk of battle for the blessing, sealing the fate of an entire generation to wander in circles until the last unbeliever fell on the sand. The divine decree that that generation would not enter the promised land transforms Israel's journey into one of the longest and most painful funeral processions in human history, where the hope of conquest is replaced by the mathematical certainty of death in the sand. Imagine the psychological weight of waking up every morning knowing that the purpose of your life is not to arrive anywhere, but only to walk in circles until your heart stops beating, fulfilling a 40-year sentence of purposeful wandering. The desert ceases to be a passageway and becomes an expanding cemetery, where each stop at the camp is marked not by military victories, but by the sound of shovels digging graves for those who fall along the way, victims of their own disbelief. Moses leads this procession of living dead with stoic patience, enduring the bitterness of a people who know they have lost their chance and who now live only to raise the next generation that will inherit what they despised. The atmosphere in the camp is thick with resentment and frustration, for there is nothing more dangerous than men who have nothing left to lose. Hopelessness is the fertile ground where rebellion takes deep root, and the authority of Moses and Aaron, once seen as liberating, is now viewed by many as the cause of their downfall, fueling the toxic lie that God's leadership is, in fact, a tyranny in disguise. It is in this climate of emotional turmoil that Korah emerges, a cousin of Moses, an influential Levite who carries in his heart the poison of spiritual envy disguised as religious democracy. He gathers 250 leaders of the congregation, men of renown and position, to challenge the exclusivity of the priesthood, using the seductive and populist argument that the whole congregation is holy and that Moses and Aaron are usurping power for themselves. Korah's envy is not about bread or water. It is about glory. He cannot bear to see another man enter the cloud where he cannot enter, proving that the ugliest battle in the church is not against external sin, but against the internal ambition of those who desire the stage without having received the calling. Moses, upon hearing the accusation, neither shouts nor orders the rebels arrested. He falls face down on the ground in a posture of terrified humility, for he knows that defying God's order in that place of holiness is spiritual suicide. He proposes a literal trial by fire, that each man take his censer and present himself before the Lord the following day. The scene is one of unbearable tension. On one side, Moses and Aaron, aged and weary. On the other, the arrogant elite of Israel, dressed in their finest clothes, holding burning coals in their hands, confident that they can force their way into God's presence through their own merits. The glory of the Lord appears to the entire congregation, not to applaud Korah's initiative, but to order immediate separation. Depart from among this congregation, that I may consume them in a moment. The judgment that follows is one of the most violent and visual interventions in all of Scripture, a geological response to human arrogance that redefined the concept of safe ground. Moses declares that if those men died the common death of all men, then God had not sent him. But if the Lord created something new and the earth opened its mouth to swallow them alive, then it would be proven that they despise the Creator. No sooner does he finish speaking than the ground beneath the tents of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram splits open with a cataclysmic roar, creating a sudden abyss that sucks men, families, possessions, and screams into the darkness of the earth. The ground closes again upon them as quickly as it opened, silencing the rebellion instantly and leaving the rest of Israel fleeing in utter panic, crying out, "Lest the earth swallow us up too." Meanwhile, fire comes forth from the presence of the Lord and consumes the 250 men who were offering incense with profane hands, transforming their bronze censers into twisted memorials of God's dangerous holiness. The lesson is brutal and unforgettable. Spiritual authority is not a human election based on popularity, but a sovereign choice of God that, when violated, brings seismic consequences for the entire community. But the terror of judgment does not immediately cure the blindness of rebellion. And the next day, incredibly, the congregation murmurs again, accusing Moses of having killed the Lord's people, proving that human stupidity often overcomes the instinct for survival. God's plague begins to sweep through the camp like an invisible wildfire, and people begin to fall dead by the thousands. It is here that we see the true nature of the priesthood that Korah envied but did not understand. Moses shouts for Aaron to take the censer, put fire from the altar and run, not walk but run, into the midst of the congregation to make atonement. Imagine the high priest, an elderly man, running in sacred robes amidst the chaos, death and contagion, physically placing himself between the dead and the living, holding the smoke of the incense as a shield against divine wrath. The plague ceases exactly where Aaron stopped, creating a dividing line between life and death, a powerful image of intercession standing in the gap to save those who deserve to die. The true leader is not the one who fights for power, but the one who runs toward the plague to save the rebels who attacked him, risking his own life to stop judgment on an ungrateful people. To end the dispute once and for all and silence the murmuring, God ordains one last silent and miraculous test where life will conquer death without words. 12 rods, one for each tribe, are placed inside the tabernacle, before the Ark of the Covenant, for an entire night. The rod is a piece of dead wood, cut from the tree without root or sap, incapable of producing life on its own. But when Moses enters the tent the next day, Aaron's rod, and only it, underwent an accelerated and impossible biological resurrection. It sprouted, produced flowers, and yielded ripe almonds in a single night. That piece of dry wood blossomed in the presence of God, proving that divine choice is not based on natural talent or human strength, but on the grace that gives life to what is dead. The other rods remained dry, but Aaron's became a perpetual sign of fruitful life, teaching Israel that true spiritual authority is that which produces life where there should only be death, and that the ministry approved by God is that which flourishes supernaturally in the secret place of His presence, far from the applause and power struggles of men. The return to Kadesh Barnea marks the closing of a dark cycle of almost 4 decades, a geographical point that functions as a cruel mirror for Israel, reflecting how much they have gone in circles without getting anywhere, both physically and spiritually. The scene is desolately familiar, the same fine dust that covers the eyelashes, the same sun that punishes the skin, and tragically, the same old bitter complaint that echoes in the tents like a broken record that refuses to stop playing. Miriam, the prophetess who led the dances at the Red Sea, dies and is buried in the hard sand of the Zin desert, and with her goes the last note of joy of the Exodus generation, leaving behind a mournful silence that is quickly filled by the cry of thirst. The new generation, though raised in the desert, has inherited the habit of murmuring from their parents, and seeing the wells dry, they turn against Moses and Aaron with renewed ferocity, wishing they had never left Egypt. For Moses, now a man of 120 years, bent under the weight of leading a people who refuse to mature, this moment is the emotional last straw. There is a weariness that goes beyond the physical. It is the fatigue of the soul of someone who has spent his entire life pouring himself out for people who repay love with stones. He prostrates himself before the tent of meeting, not only in adoration, but in utter exhaustion, seeking an answer from God to a problem that seems to have no solution. How to quench the thirst of people whose hearts are dry. The divine instruction that comes from glory is specific and full of grace. Take the staff and speak to the rock. God, in his perfect pedagogy, wanted to demonstrate that after 40 years of relationship and law, provision no longer needed to be wrested by force, but could be released by the word of faith. But when Moses rises and walks toward the cliff before the hostile crowd, something breaks within him. The titanic patience that endured Pharaoh, the Red Sea, and the golden calf finally cracks under the accumulated pressure of decades of ingratitude. He looks at those faces distorted by anger, and in a moment of devastating human failure, ceases to represent God and instead represents his own frustration. Hear now, you rebels, shall we bring water for you out of this rock? The pronoun we is the fatal error. He takes the leading role in the miracle, and instead of speaking to the rock as a trusting servant, he strikes it twice with the staff, transforming an act of grace into a blow of violence. The water gushes forth abundantly because God's faithfulness to the people is not nullified by the leader's failure. And the multitude drinks and is satisfied, oblivious to the spiritual drama that has just unfolded. But in the silence that follows the miracle, the voice of God whispers the sentence that would break the prophet's heart into 1,000 pieces. Because you did not believe in me, you shall not bring this congregation into the land that I have given them. That moment of anger cost Moses the dream of his entire life, teaching us with terrifying rigor that the higher the level of leadership, the greater the demand for holiness, and that misrepresenting God's character is an offense he does not let go unpunished, not even for his closest friend. The pain of Moses' disqualification does not paralyze the march, for God's purpose is greater than the destiny of one man, and the journey continues around the land of Edom, a long and arduous path that again tests the patience of the soul of the people. Impatience is the trigger for the next catastrophe, for when the people begin to speak again against God and against Moses, calling the heavenly manna vile bread, divine protection is withdrawn, and the desert reveals its true predatory nature. Fiery serpents invade the camp, silently slithering into the tents, biting men, women, and children with a venom that burns like fire in the veins. Chaos is absolute, The camp that complained of boredom now screams in agony, and swollen, dying bodies pile up on the ground, a horrific visual representation of the poison of ingratitude that had already circulated in their hearts long before the snakes arrived. The people, confronted with imminent death, run to Moses, begging for intercession, finally recognizing that their sin of the tongue has brought physical judgment. And God, in one of the most mysterious and powerful prefigurations of Calvary, orders the construction of a strange symbol, a bronze serpent raised on a pole. Divine logic inverts human medicine. Healing does not come from an antidote, an herb, or an effort to kill the snakes, but from an act of looking with faith at the symbol of judgment erected on high. Whoever looks will live. It is the theology of grace in its rawest form. Whoever is bitten by sin can only be healed by looking at him who became sin, cursed, for us on the cross. A lesson that salvation comes through visual faith in God's provision, not by fighting the poison with one's own strength. Recovered from the plague and instructed by pain, the new generation of Israel begins to experience something their parents never knew: the taste of military victory. As they approach the lands east of the Jordan, they confront kings Sihon and Og, legendary giants who ruled fortified territories and fearsome armies. Moses, knowing his days are numbered and that he will not inherit the land, leads these battles not for himself, but for the future he will not live to see. There is a tragic and sublime nobility in this old warrior commanding the conquest of Transjordan, fighting with all his might to secure cities and pastures that will be inhabited by others. Israel sweeps away the Amorite armies with supernatural strength, taking possession of fertile lands and walled cities, and for the first time in 40 years, they are no longer nomads wandering in the void, but conquerors establishing roots. These initial victories serve as a morale boost for a people who grew up hearing stories of defeat, proving to them that giants can fall and that God's promises, though delayed, are invincible when the appointed time arrives. Moses sees in the gleam of the young soldier's eyes the birth of the warrior nation that Joshua will lead, and finds solace in the fact that, although he will not cross the river, his work has prepared the generation that will. The camp finally settles on the plains of Moab, facing Jericho, separated from the promise only by the muddy waters of the Jordan River. It is here that the threat changes form. It is no longer armies or snakes, but spiritual seduction. Balak, king of Moab, terrified by the multitude of Israel, hires Balaam, a mercenary prophet, to curse God's people. The plot unfolding in the mountains above the camp is invisible to the Israelites below. While they sleep, cook, and live their routines, a war of words and curses is being waged in the high places. Balaam tries 3 times and at 3 different altars to pronounce the ruin of Israel. But God ties his tongue and transforms each attempt at a curse into an irrevocable blessing. How can I curse what God has not cursed? This invisible protection is one of the greatest demonstrations of God's care. He defends his people from dangers they don't even know exist, blocking the enemy's evil intentions in the spiritual realm before they can manifest in the material. Israel remains blessed not because it is perfect. After all, they would soon fall prey to the seduction of the Moabite women at Baal Peor, but because God's faithfulness to his covenant is greater than the machinations of any sorcerer. Moses, upon learning of these plots, understands once again that Israel's safety never depended on the people's righteousness, but on the immutable sovereignty of the one who brought them out of Egypt, and that against the chosen people, no enchantment or divination prevails. The certainty of the end doesn't come to Moses with the terror of surprise, but with the solemn serenity of one who sees the sun setting after an endless and exhausting day of work. God warns him that the time of his departure is near, and the immediate reaction of that old shepherd of nations is not to fight for his own life or plead for another year of leadership, but to worry with an almost maternal love about the flock that will be left without a shepherd. There is a desolate nobility in Moses' prayer in Numbers 27, where he asks the Lord to raise up a man over the congregation so that they may not be like sheep without a shepherd. It is the supreme moment of the death of the ministerial ego. He's not concerned with building a monument to his legacy or ensuring that his biological children inherit the throne, but with ensuring that God's work continues in the hands of another. The choice falls on Joshua, the man who stood in his shadow for 40 years, the silent warrior who did not leave the tent when everyone else departed, the one who learned faithfulness not on the stage, but behind the scenes of service. The transfer of authority is a public and visceral scene of humility. Moses, the man who spoke face to face with God, places his wrinkled, heavy, anointed hands on the head of his young successor before the priest Eleazar and the entire congregation. In that gesture of laying on of hands, he is not merely transferring a bureaucratic office, but pouring out his own dignity and spirit upon Joshua, voluntarily emptying himself of his authority to empower the next generation. It's a painful and necessary lesson for any leader. True success is not being indispensable forever, but becoming dispensable because you have prepared someone to go beyond where you have been. The people watch in reverent silence, realizing that the era of the great liberator is drawing to a close and that their security cannot depend on the longevity of one man, but on the continuity of the Spirit of God that passes from one vessel to another without losing its potency. But before ascending the final mountain to die, Moses has one last titanic task to accomplish. He must preach the sermon of his life, a passionate and urgent recapitulation of all the lore and history they have lived together. The plains of Moab become a natural amphitheater for the voice of this 120-year-old man, who has lost neither vigor nor the sparkle in his eyes. The book of Deuteronomy is not merely a repetition of ancient rules. It is the testament of a dying father desperately trying to engrave the truth on the hearts of forgotten children. He recounts the journey, not to boast, but to remind them of their own rebellion and God's scandalous faithfulness. He recounts the failures of Kadesh Barnea, the fire of Sinai, the provision of manna, and the danger of idolatry, weaving a narrative that connects the past of slavery to the future of freedom. There is a palpable urgency in his voice, a prophetic warning tone from one who knows that the prosperity of the Promised Land will be a far more difficult test than the scarcity of the desert. He knows that when they eat and are satisfied, when they build fine houses and see their livestock increase, the danger of forgetting the Lord will be deadly. Therefore, he hammers home the importance of memory. Beware lest you forget. Moses' preaching is an act of spiritual combat against Israel's future amnesia, an attempt to vaccinate the nation's soul against the virus of ingratitude that he saw destroy the previous generation. He is not merely teaching laws, he is fighting for the spiritual survival of a people he loves more than life itself, imploring them to love the Lord not out of fear, but with all their heart, with all their soul, and with all their strength, for he knows that only radical love can keep them faithful in a land full of seductive gods. The climax of this final discourse is one of the most dramatic moments in biblical literature, where Moses summons the universe itself to witness his appeal. I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, blessing and curse. Therefore, choose life, that you and your offspring may live. The choice is binary, clear, and inescapable. There is no neutral zone, no middle ground. Moses places before them the absolute moral responsibility for their own destiny. He makes it clear that entering the land is not the end of the story, but the beginning of a covenant that demands daily obedience. He prophesies with heart-wrenching sadness that they will stray, that they will break the covenant, and that they will suffer exile, but he also prophesies that even at the ends of the heavens, if they seek the Lord, they will find him. It is the vision of a prophet who sees centuries ahead, witnessing the unfaithfulness of Israel and the invincible mercy of God dancing together throughout history. That sermon on the plains of Moab is Moses' intellectual and spiritual legacy, a document that would shape Jewish consciousness for millennia, teaching that the relationship with God is not magical, but ethical, covenantal, and based on responsive love. As he speaks, the desert wind blows his garments, and the people look at that giant of faith, realizing that those words are the last drops of wisdom from a wellspring about to be drawn into eternity. After teaching the law, Moses transitions from the role of legislator to that of poet and prophet, teaching Israel a song they should have on their lips as a testimony against themselves. The Song of Moses in Deuteronomy 32 is a masterpiece of sung theology, a melody that narrates the faithfulness of the rock and the corruption of his children. He sings of how God found them in a desert land and in a lonely and howling wilderness, and how he guided and instructed them as the apple of his eye. The music serves as a mnemonic device, an indestructible pedagogical tool that penetrates where prose does not reach, ensuring that even when they forget the sermons, the melody of truth will still haunt their consciences in the days of apostasy. And then, in a final gesture of patriarchal fatherhood, he gathers the tribes for the final blessing, pronouncing prophetic destinies upon Reuben, Judah, Levi, Joseph, and all the others. Unlike Jacob, who mixed blessings with harsh rebukes, Moses, at the end of his life, chooses to bless the people with hope and grace, seeing them not as they are in their weakness, but as they can be in God. People saved by the Lord, the shield of your help, and the sword of your majesty. He ends his public ministry not with a note of bitterness for denied entry, but with a declaration of victory over the people who so often wounded him, proving that the heart of the true intercessor forgives and blesses until his last breath. Finally, the moment of necessary solitude arrives. The divine order is clear and irrevocable. Go up Mount Nebo and die on the mountain you are about to ascend. Nathan, the physical separation from the people, is a heartbreaking scene, but one imbued with supernatural dignity. Moses begins to walk away from the camp, leaving behind Joshua, the elders, and the multitude he carried in his arms for 40 years. He does not look back with regret, but with the certainty of duty fulfilled. The path to the summit of Nebo is steep and lonely. Each step is a farewell to the earthly world and an approach to the celestial world. He ascends with his physical vigor intact. His eyes were not dim, nor his natural force abated, which makes his death not a biological failure, but an act of voluntary obedience. He is ascending to a rendezvous with his Creator, not to be judged, but to be gathered. The silence of the mountain envelops him. The noise of the camp becomes a distant whisper, and Moses, the man who began his journey in a basket on the Nile River and passed through the palaces of Egypt and the sands of Midian, now finds himself alone between heaven and earth, ready for the last and greatest revelation that God has reserved for the end of his career. The final ascent to the summit of Mount Nebo is one of the most solitary and sublime journeys ever recorded in human experience, a path where each step upwards represents a progressive detachment from earthly concerns and a dizzying approach to the pure presence of God. Moses climbs alone, leaving behind the noise of 2 million people, the weight of leadership, theological disputes, and the memories of 40 years of sand and miracles, entering a rarefied silence where only he and the Creator exist. The biblical text makes a point of highlighting a disturbing and marvelous physical detail. His eyes were not dim, nor his natural force abated. This means that he is not dying from biological failure. He is not a trembling old man being dragged by decrepitude to the grave. He is a man in full vital force, with a sharp mind and a robust body, climbing the mountain to die solely out of obedience to a divine command. There is an overwhelming dignity in this scene, for Moses walks toward his own death with the same firmness with which he walked toward Pharaoh, proving that his life was not taken from him by nature, but voluntarily surrendered to the author of life. The wind that blows on the summit of Pisgah does not carry the scent of death, but the freshness of a satisfying conclusion, and when he reaches the highest point, he does not find the emptiness of the end, but the company of the one who has been with him since the burning bush, transforming the place of execution into a sanctuary of final intimacy where servant and Lord converse for the last time on this side of eternity. And then God opens before him the panoramic panorama of the promise, a supernatural vision that transcends human optical capacity, allowing Moses to see from Gilead to Dan all the territory of Naphtali, the land of Ephraim and Manasseh, to the western sea and the Negev. God is not merely showing geography, he is showing the future, validating the suffering of the past with the tangible reality of fulfillment. Imagine the complex emotion that floods the prophet's heart as he sees the green hills, the fertile valleys, and the springs of water he has dreamed of for decades, knowing that his feet will never tread that grass, but that his people, the children of his sorrow, will dwell there in safety. God says, "This is the land I swore to Abraham. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you will not cross over there." To carnal ears, this sounds like a final cruelty, a bitter punishment for a man who gave his all, but to the ears of the Spirit, this is a severe and profound grace. God is telling Moses that his mission has been fulfilled. He was the liberator, the lawgiver, the guide through the desert, but the conquest belongs to another. Moses represents the law, which guides us through the desert, shows us sin, and leads us to the border. But he cannot make us enter the land of grace. That is the task of Joshua, whose name is Yeshua, Jesus, the only one capable of making us cross the Jordan of death and take possession of life. Moses accepts this limitation not with bitterness, but with the peace of one who understands that his role in God's great tapestry has been perfectly executed, and that seeing the promise fulfilled in the lives of others is, in itself, a sufficient reward for the true intercessor. The death of Moses on Mount Nebo is shrouded in a tender mystery that challenges our understanding of mortality. For Scripture simply states that Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there. According to the word of the Lord. Jewish tradition, with unparalleled poetic beauty, suggests that he died with the kiss of God, a metaphor for a painless, agony-free departure, where the soul is gently gathered by the breath of the Creator, like one who removes a hair from milk. There was no illness, no decay, only a gentle transition from a state of earthly friendship to eternal communion. And what happens next is the most unique funerary act in history. God himself buries Moses in a valley in the land of Moab, opposite Beth Peor, and no one knows his burial place to this day. The divine wisdom in this secret burial is profound and protective. If Moses' tomb were known, it would instantly become the greatest idol of Israel, a place of pilgrimage and undue worship that would divert the focus from the God of Moses to Moses' bones. God protects the legacy of his servant by ensuring that it does not become an object of posthumous idolatry, teaching us that the greatest man of God is the one who disappears so that the glory of the Lord may remain. Moses dies in the solitude of the mountain, without a stone monument, without a golden mausoleum, but with the supreme honor of having God himself as his gravedigger, resting in human obscurity to shine in the eternal memory of heaven. Down below, on the plains of Moab, the people mourn Moses' death for 30 days, a national mourning that marks the end of a foundational era that would never be repeated. They look at the silent mountain and realize, perhaps too late, the magnitude of the man who had lived among them. The final sentence of the Pentateuch is the ultimate epitaph, not written on a tombstone, but in the Bible. Never again has there arisen in Israel a prophet like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. This statement closes the book of Deuteronomy with a seal of incomparability. Moses was not merely a political leader or a miracle worker, he was God's friend, the man who endured seeing the form of the Lord and survived, the mediator who carried the weight of an entire nation on his chest. But Moses' death also brings a vital lesson of continuity. God buries his workers, but carries on his work. The death of the prophet is not the death of the promise. Joshua, filled with the spirit of wisdom because Moses had laid his hands upon him, now rises to take command. The sorrow of mourning must give way to the urgency of conquest. The tears must dry so that the swords may be sharpened. Israel learns that leaders are temporary, but God's purpose is generational and unstoppable. Moses leaves the scene, but the pillar of cloud remains, the ark of the covenant remains, and the word written by him remains, ready to guide the feet of a new generation through the waters of the Jordan. Moses' legacy transcends his physical death in a way he could never have imagined as he gazed upon the promised land from atop Mount Nebo. He did not enter Canaan that day, but centuries later on another mountain, the Mount of Transfiguration, he would appear alive and glorious, conversing with Jesus, finally stepping into the promised land, not as an earthly conqueror, but as a heavenly witness to the ultimate redemption. His life, marked by baskets of reeds, burning bushes, parted seas, and tablets of stone, becomes the framework upon which all biblical revelation is built. He teaches us that failure is not the end, that stuttering does not impede prophecy, that the desert is the school of holiness, and that true freedom comes at a high price. Moses' story does not end in the unknown tomb in Moab. It continues to resonate each time someone decides to confront the pharaohs of this world, armed only with faith in the great I Am. He was the man who saw God from behind in the cleft of the rock, but who now, in eternity, sees him face to face, completing the journey that began in the waters of the Nile and ended in the Father's arms. And for us who are still on the journey, his life remains like a high beacon in the middle of the desert, reminding us that it is worthwhile to leave behind the treasures of Egypt to seek the invisible reward, and that in the end, the only thing that truly matters is having the testimony that we were in our generations faithful servants of the Lord. The 30-day mourning period on the plains of Moab ends not with a miraculous sign in the sky, but with a heavy, expectant silence that hangs over the camp like a morning mist that lingers slowly. Moses' absence is an emotional crater in the heart of the nation, a leadership vacuum that causes every Hebrew to look at the prophet's empty tent with a mixture of orphanhood and contained panic. Joshua, the man upon whom the old shepherd's hands were laid, feels the weight of this absence more than anyone else. He is not Moses. He does not possess the staff that parted the Red Sea. He lacks the eloquence of grand speeches, and in the secret of his heart, he struggles against the gigantic shadow of having to replace the irreplaceable. The atmosphere in the camp is dangerously fragile, for the transition of leadership is the most vulnerable moment for any people, the breach where the enemy waits to attack doubt before the new authority consolidates. Joshua walks among the tents, feeling the comparing glances, hearing the whisper of fear that questions whether God will continue to be God without his favorite mediator. The psychological pressure on this general's shoulders is overwhelming. He has the mission of leading a weary people to war against giants in fortified cities, and the only guarantee he has is the memory of the anointing he received and the silent faithfulness of a God who, until that moment, seemed to speak only to his predecessor. It is the ultimate test of identity, to discover if you are merely the assistant of a great man, or if you are, in fact, one chosen by the great God. It is in this scenario of paralyzing insecurity that the voice of the Lord breaks through the morning, not to console Joshua with sweet words, but to confront him with the harsh reality of death and the urgency of life. "Moses, my servant, is dead. Now therefore arise, go over this Jordan." The brutality of this divine phrase, "Moses is dead," is necessary to break the paralysis of nostalgia. God is saying that the time for looking to the past is over and that the work did not die with the worker. The promise that follows is the fuel that rekindles the furnace of courage. "As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not leave you nor forsake you." God does not promise Joshua that he will be like Moses, but he promises that he will be the same God. The insistent repetition of the command, "Be strong and courageous," reveals that fear was present in the heart of the new leader. For courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. Joshua understands in that sacred conversation that his authority will not come from imitating Moses' gestures, but from obedience to the same word. The law that Moses wrote must not depart from his mouth. He must meditate on it day and night. This is the key to successful succession. Continuity lies not in the leader's personality, but in the centrality of Scripture. Armed with this certainty, Joshua leaves the tent not as the shadow of a dead prophet, but as the general of the Lord's army, giving the order that electrifies the camp. "Prepare food, for in 3 days you will cross this Jordan." The time of passive manna is over. The time of the sword and conquest has begun. The mobilization of the people for the crossing is a spectacle of renewed faith, where the sadness of mourning is replaced by the adrenaline of the imminent promise. But there is a terrifying physical obstacle that military strategy cannot solve. The Jordan River is at its flood stage, overflowing its banks, transformed into a furious, muddy torrent that drags trees and stones with deadly violence. For the spies watching from the shore, crossing that with women, children, and livestock seems like a suicidal mission, a repetition of the nightmare of the Red Sea, but without Moses' staff to open the way. God's strategy for Joshua is radically different from that of Moses, proving that he does not repeat his methods. At the Red Sea, Moses touched the waters before the people entered. At the Jordan, the priests must tread on the water while it is still flowing. It is the pedagogy of mature faith. God demands that we set foot in death before seeing the manifestation of life. The order is for the Ark of the Covenant, the golden box that carries the presence, to go ahead about a kilometer away from the people so that everyone can see the way they must follow. There is a liturgical and tense silence as the Levites raise the poles of the ark and begin to walk toward the muddy water, carrying the throne of God toward the impossible obstacle. The people watch, holding their breath, knowing that this is the moment of truth. If the God of Moses is not the God of Joshua, they will all be swept away by the current to their death. The moment the soles of the priests' feet touch the edge of the water is one of the most sublime turning points in biblical history. There is no east wind, no thunder, only the silent obedience of men who trust more in the weight of the glory they carry on their shoulders than in the force of the current lapping at their ankles. At the exact instant of contact, The waters flowing down from above stop, piling up into an invisible wall far away in the city of Adam, while the waters below drain into the Dead Sea, leaving the riverbed dry and exposed. The miracle happens, but it requires human participation. The priests must remain standing in the middle of the riverbed, holding the ark, while the entire nation passes. They become the living pillars of Israel's security, sustaining God's presence in the place of danger so that the people can cross over to the promise. Joshua commands the crossing, not with the trembling voice of a novice, but with the authority of one who has seen the impossible bow before the word. Israel walks along the dry bed of the Jordan River, and each step over those river stones is a step out of the desert and into their inheritance. They are finally setting foot on the land that Moses saw from afar, completing the journey that began with a basket on the Nile and now ends with an entire nation coming home. So that this moment would never be forgotten, Joshua ordered 12 men, one from each tribe, to take 12 stones from the middle of the Jordan River, from the exact spot where the priest's feet had stood. These stones were not precious jewels, but common river rocks, worn down by erosion, yet they carried the tactile testimony of the miracle. They were erected in Gilgal as a rustic and eternal monument, a pedagogical memorial for future generations. Joshua declared, "When your children ask, 'What stones are these?' then you shall tell them, 'Israel crossed this Jordan on dry ground.'" Biblical faith is not an ethereal sentiment. It is a memory anchored in real history. Those stones serve to ensure that the story of liberation does not become a mythological legend, but remains a geographical fact. By leaving the river and camping in Gilgal, the shame of slavery in Egypt was finally rolled away from them. Gilgal means to roll. Circumcision is renewed, Passover is celebrated on earth, and the cycle of reproach is broken. They are no longer runaway slaves or rejected nomads. They are the rightful owners of the land, ready to reclaim what heaven has given them. And then, the final miracle occurs, the most subtle and profound of all. The manna ceases. The day after Passover, after eating the fruit of the land, the roasted wheat and unleavened bread of Canaan, the white flakes that fell from heaven for 40 years simply stop appearing. There is no warning, no farewell. The supernatural provision of spiritual infancy gives way to the natural provision of maturity. God is saying to Israel, "You have grown. Now you will plant, harvest, and eat the fruit of your labor under my blessing." The end of the manna is not the end of grace, but the change in the form of grace. They cease to be fed by hand as infants and begin to sit at the table as adult children and warriors. Joshua looks at the people eating the bread of the land and knows that the transition is complete. Moses, the friend of God, rests in peace on Mount Nebo, but his mission lives on in every ear of wheat that Israel harvests, in every city they will conquer, and in every memorial stone at Gilgal. The promise has been fulfilled. The God who leads out of Egypt is the same God who brings them into Canaan, and the story of Moses, far from ending in a lonely death, now flourishes in the vibrant life of a nation that has finally arrived home. The story of Moses does not end with the silence of the unknown tomb in Moab, nor with the dust settling on Joshua's feet in Jericho. It leaps through the centuries to find its definitive resolution on another mountain, far higher and more significant than Nebo or Sinai. The prophecy he himself uttered in Deuteronomy, "The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among your own people, from your brothers," hovered over the history of Israel like a suspended promise, a long shadow seeking the body that cast it. For 1,500 years, the law of Moses guided, corrected, and condemned the people, serving as a stern tutor that pointed the way to holiness but could not provide the strength to walk it. But then, on a silent night on Mount Tabor, or Hermon, the curtain of time is torn and eternity invades the geography of Galilee. Jesus, the carpenter from Nazareth, the great prophet, ascends the mountain with Peter, James, and John, and there, while praying, his appearance is transfigured, shining with the uncreated light that Moses only glimpsed from behind in the cleft of the rock. And in that moment of nuclear glory, two men appear in glory to converse with him, Elijah representing the prophets and Moses representing the law. This is the moment of supreme vindication, the final healing for the soul of the old intercessor. Moses, who died pleading to enter the good land and had his request denied because of a blow of anger against the rock, now physically treads upon the promised land, not as a military conqueror covered in dust and fatigue, but as a glorified saint, an honored guest to witness the final exodus that Jesus was about to accomplish in Jerusalem. The conversation between Moses and Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration is the theological axis that unites the two testaments, the encounter of the faithful servant with the perfect Son. They do not speak of the glory of the past, nor of the plagues of Egypt or the parting of the Red Sea. Luke tells us that they spoke of his departure, his exodus, which Jesus was about to accomplish on the cross. Moses, the man who instituted Passover with the blood of lambs on the doorposts of Egypt, is now looking into the eyes of the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. He understands, with a clarity that Sinai could never give him, that all the sacrifices, the entire tabernacle, all the manna and all the water from the rock were merely pale shadows drawn in the sand to prepare the world for this man. The law came through Moses, full of demands and shadows. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ, full of light and fulfillment. There, on the top of that mountain, the frustration of Kadesh Barnea is dissolved in the glory of redemption. Moses realizes that being prevented from entering earthly Canaan was a severe preparation so that he could point to a heavenly, superior, and eternal Canaan. When the luminous cloud envelops them and the Father's voice declares, "This is my beloved Son, listen to him," Moses disappears from the vision, leaving only Jesus. It is the final lesson of the greatest prophet of the Old Testament. His ministry was a finger pointing to Christ, and once Christ is revealed, the prophet can retreat to the joy of anonymity, knowing that his mission was fulfilled not when he was exalted, but when he led the eyes of the world to the Savior. Moses' legacy, therefore, is not a cold marble statue or a legal code engraved in dead stone, but a life that prefigures every believer's journey toward freedom. He is the prototype of the liberator who suffers for his people, the intercessor who stands in the gap between divine wrath and human weakness, the leader who accepts rejection from his brothers in order to save them. His life teaches us that failure is not a final sentence. The fugitive murderer of Midian became the meekest man on earth, proving that God does not consult our criminal past to determine our ministerial future. Moses' stutter, his chronic insecurity, and his moments of deep depression were not obstacles to grace, but stages where God's power was perfected in weakness. He shows us that God does not seek supermen with impeccable resumes, but broken vessels that, precisely because of their cracks, let the light of the treasure they carry within shine through. Moses' greatness lay not in his ability to part the sea, but in his willingness to climb the mountain, remove his sandals, and remain in God's presence until his face shone, refusing to live by anything other than the word of God. Now the desert dust has settled, the Jordan River has returned to its course, and the echoes of Sinai's thunder have been absorbed by history. But the question that the basket in the Nile cast upon the waters continues to float toward your life today. The biography of Moses was not preserved in Scripture as an unattainable museum piece to be admired from afar, but as an urgent and uncomfortable mirror positioned before your soul. Perhaps you, like him, began life feeling adrift, abandoned by circumstances or hiding for fear of a death sentence cast against your dreams. Perhaps you grew up in an Egypt that gave you food and education, but never gave you identity, living with the unbearable tension of trying to be someone you are not, wearing princely masks to hide the wounds of a slave. Or perhaps you are now in your own desert of Midian, in that place of silence and darkness where your grand, youthful plans failed, tending sheep that are not yours, convinced that your best days are behind you and that God has forgotten your address in the sand. The story of Moses shouts to you that the desert is not a cemetery, but a classroom, that God's silence is not absence, but preparation, and that the 40 years of waiting were not wasted time, but the necessary time to remove Egypt from within you so that God could put heaven in its place. The burning bush is still burning, not on Mount Horeb, but in the corners of your daily life, in those moments when the ordinary is invaded by the sacred, and you feel the call to something greater than your own survival. God is still looking for people who have the courage to say, "Here I am," despite their stutters, their fears, and their stained pasts. He is not asking you to have a magic staff or to know how to speak eloquently. He is asking you to take off the sandals of your pride, recognize that the place where you are, even if it is a place of pain, is holy ground, and to surrender to Him the little you have in your hand. The final invitation of this journey is not for you to try to be a hero who parts the sea with the strength of his arm, but for you to learn to trust in the God who can open a path where there is no path. The bitter waters of Mara in your life can become sweet if you cast the wood of the cross into them. The giants that inhabit your promised land can fall if you stop seeing yourself as a grasshopper and start seeing yourself as a beloved child. The torch that Moses carried, that stubborn faith that endured Pharaoh and saw the invisible, was not extinguished with his death. It was passed on to Joshua, then to the judges, to the prophets, to the apostles, and now it is extended toward you, waiting to be grasped by trembling but willing hands. You don't need to be perfect. Moses wasn't. You will fail. You will strike the rock in anger. You will feel like giving up when the people murmur. But the grace that sustained him until he was 120 years old, with eyes that did not dim and vigor that did not falter, is the same grace available to you today. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is your God. He is calling you to step out of your comfort zone, to face your fears, and to lead your own life and your family toward the promise. Don't die in the desert of unbelief. Lift your eyes, see the land He has prepared, and take the first step toward the Jordan. The journey is dangerous, yes, but the presence goes before you. And at the end of it all, when your journey is over, may you climb your own mountain, look back without regrets, and hear the Father's whisper saying, "Well done, faithful servant, enter into the joy of your Lord." Moses' story ended, but yours continues. The pen is in your hand, and the Red Sea lies before you. What will you do?